Okay, we are going to be continuing tonight our exploration of your family. If you've heard me in a class more than for about 2 minutes, you know I tend to talk really, really fast. I'm about to do it even worse. So stay with me. We're going to go really quickly. I'm going to assume that I've got at least one or two of you here who weren't here last week to hear the intro to this. So I'm going to quickly recap what we're doing. We are talking about we're drawing some lines between who you were to who you are. The purpose in this, if you weren't with us last week, the purpose is not to blame our family for our problems. The purpose is not to demonize anything in our family history. The purpose is just to get a clear map on why we may do some of the things that we do and why we may feel some of the things that we feel. Last week we talked about our family of origin collecting bags over the years, and then they hand those bags down to us until we end up in a situation that looks like this. Now, we also talked about the fact that in these bags, it's not all bad stuff. Generally speaking, when we talk about our family of origin, and especially if we're going to use the word baggage, we have a tendency to think of a really negative connotation. We talked last week about the fact that sometimes what's in those bags is treasures. We find wisdom, we find faith, we find really, really good nuggets of a strong family. So I don't want you to feel like I'm demonizing your past. That's not the point. We also talked a little bit about how our past is a lot like a bike leaned against a tree. Over time, the tree can absorb that bike and can still grow a healthy, functioning tree, but that bike is forever going to be a part of what grows in that tree. Now, to touch on something we didn't talk about a lot last week, I get a lot of people, not a lot, I get some people who are reluctant to do this. They don't see the point in bringing up old stuff. The reason we're doing this is not just so you have weapons to use against your spouse later in fights. It's not just so you have cheap shots that you can take. We do this because you're getting a map as to why your spouse thinks the way they think, why they act the way they act. Somebody who grew up in a home with a father who had an unpredictable temper. So if you take, for example, a daughter who grows up in a home with a dad who has an unpredictable temper, I would expect her to be fairly defensive. I would expect her to oftentimes fight pretty severely against the fact that you should not be upset with her. So rather than addressing the problem, she's more likely to address the fact that you're angry. And the reason for that is not because she's crazy, and it's not because she's mean, and it's not because she won't listen to you. It's because she grew up in a home where temper was thrown in an unpredictable manner. And as a result, they had 18 years of conditioning to respond to anger in the way she's responding to it with you. Somebody who grew up in a home where sadness wasn't really addressed, which applies to a lot of the men in this room, you're going to struggle when sadness is brought into your home, because the reality is sadness is going to be a part of your life. It's going to be a part of your marriage, and there's going to be moments and times where you may be accused of being insensitive or of not listening because you don't really know what to do with sadness. Tonight we're going to talk about those things. The exercise tonight is not about complaining that your mom didn't hug you enough. Right? Now, if you want to do that, be my guest, but that's not the goal tonight. The goal is not to go home and have an emotional phone call where you call mom and say, I figured it out tonight. It's all because of you. You hugged me too much. You didn't hug me enough. You hugged my brother more than you hugged me. You gave me the toy. You didn't give me the toy. That's not the goal. Okay, tonight the goal is not blame, it's understanding. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking for. I want to remind you of what I reminded you of last week. For many of you, tonight, this 40 minutes that we've got left is the only opportunity you're going to have to really have this conversation, because your life is kind of crazy. And as I say, your life is kind of crazy, I can't help but notice the Mayberries who had a baby like 20 minutes ago and are still sitting here. So life can get really super crazy. So tonight may be the only opportunity you have to have these conversations. So I want to encourage you to dig deep into those conversations. Now, if you will go home and have these conversations, great. You are my honor student. But if not, I want to commit tonight to giving the next 40 minutes to your spouse. There's a reason I'm talking fast. I don't have a lot of stuff to say tonight, but I want you to have a lot of time to talk. So that's the goal. For you veterans of marriage who roll your eyes at the notion that we're going to be exploring your past, I want to encourage you to get past your hangups. And the reason I want you to get past your hangups is because your opinion of your spouse's past is oftentimes rooted not in their perception and not in their reality. It's rooted in your opinions that you formulated over time. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get into the conversation tonight. Let's take a look at page 2. As you're looking at page 2, I want to quickly mention something to those of you who are here sans spouse. So I've got a bunch of you that I'm looking at who don't have spouses with you. That is okay. Thank you for being here. Here's what I want you to do. If you were in my office doing marriage counseling and we were going through these questions, before we have the conversation, I would give them to you a week in advance. And what I would ask you to do is go home, don't talk about them, go home and think about them. And I would actually ask you to write down what you might say when you have this conversation with your spouse. So if you don't have your spouse here tonight, you actually have kind of a weird advantage. What I want you to do if your spouse isn't here, I want you to go through every one of these questions and I want you to think about what you might say, maybe jot down some notes as to what comes to mind, because being prepared for this conversation can make it a lot better. All right, having said that, the first thing is love and affection. No, we don't have as many 80s rock fans as I thought. All right, thank you. For those of you who know who that is Nelson. Every time I look at this handout, I start singing this, and I despise 1990. All right, so here's what I want you to do. We're going to start each of these sections with a brief quiz. That quiz is not to determine whether or not you are broken with this specific emotion. It's to determine how comfortable you may be with it based on your past experience. That is all. I'm going to give you about a minute to do it. You'll notice the scoring guide on top. If you were with me last week, you know what that scoring guide is. Strongly agree is worth 2 points. Strongly disagree is worth -2 points. And there's a scale based on each one of those answers. Again, and I'll say it as I said it last week, if you don't understand the scoring guide or can't do the math, ask your wife. She'll be happy to do it for you. Take a look at question 10. I am going to give you about a minute. Go ahead and start the quiz and total up your score. And in about a minute, I'll get back to you as to what we're going to do next. There is a number that we are looking for. Now, this number is going to change with each one of these emotions, but for this specific emotion, here's what we're looking for. On this little quiz, if you scored a 10 or above, to me that indicates that your emotional history allows you to feel comfortable expressing love and affection, but it's more than just expressing love and affection. It's also about receiving love and affection, because we don't really talk about that in a marriage. We don't talk about the fact that sometimes it's the receiving love and affection that makes us uncomfortable if it's not in our background. If you scored a 10 or above, my guess is those two things are fairly comfortable for you. If you scored below a 10, as I said, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means that sometimes you may doubt whether you're loved. You may doubt expressions of love. You may question them. You may not know exactly what to do with them. And you may not be great at doing them without prompting. You may have been accused of not holding your wife's hand enough or of not giving enough physical displays of affection. That may be in your history if you are in that category. Now, here's what I want you to do. With each one of these emotions, the first one being love and affection, if you'll turn the page over to page 3, there are 3 questions. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to work through those 3 questions together. I told you tonight is about you talking, just like we always do. Those 3 questions are intended to be a guide. They are flexible. If you end up kind of going a different way, go a different way. But I want you to take a look at those questions, and I want you to note if there's any area that you struggle in or if there's anything specifically that stands out in that conversation that you may need to go back to. For the sake of time, we're not going to have time to go deep into every one of them, so I want to make sure you've had a chance to explore each of them. All right, I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning when this conversation is up, but until you hear that, just keep talking to your spouse. All right, let's take a look at the next section at the category that is probably the scariest for most of you. Let's take a look at anger. Here is what I want. On page 3, you will find your short anger quiz. Go ahead and get started on that. I'll give you about a minute. Do the quiz, do the score. I'll give you the number. All right, if you will wrap up your quiz and quickly total your score. Okay, now I told you that with each section there's going to be a different number and that the number was going to mean something different. So here is your anger item score. If you scored a 6 or above, you are probably not comfortable with the expression and experience of anger. So if you scored a 6 or above, it indicates to me that anger was something your family may have struggled with in terms of how to conceptualize it. If you have difficulty becoming angry, you probably scored over a 6. If you struggle with the way other people express anger towards you, my guess is you probably scored over a 6. If you scored under that, then anger is probably a fairly comfortable emotion for you. Let's talk about anger for just a second before we get into the discussion part. Anger is, for a lot of boys in particular, anger is the only emotion they're allowed to feel. Now, you may have heard that. You may have had people say that to you. Anger for a lot of young boys is the only emotion they're allowed to feel. When they cry, we tell them not to be crybabies. When they whine, we tell them not to whine. When they do just about any kind of emotion, with the exception of excited or angry, we tell them to stop immediately. And when they get angry, we don't necessarily tell them not to be angry, we tell them not to break stuff. So what they get is the lesson that anger is okay, it is the only emotion that's okay, and then 40 years later, when your husband doesn't understand how to connect with you emotionally, that's kind of the end result of that. Okay, so exploring your anger is actually really, really, really important. That is what we're going to be doing with the following questions. If you will flip over to page 4. I want you to talk about how anger was expressed in your family. Now, I am not exclusively interested in the husband's take on this, but I'm more interested in the husband's take on this. Wives, your opinion on this is just as important because how you perceived anger in your home as a kid is by and large going to paint how you perceive it as a wife. Okay, so the reactions are really important and how those two things play together are really important, but husbands in particular, when it comes to the research in families and what makes families work and how families navigate tough emotion, by and large anger is controlled by the husband. Now, that's not exclusive, but by and large in the research, that's what it is. Here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 minutes to talk through those 3 questions. When you're done, I want to make a couple of quick points about this one specifically before we move on to the next one, because anger is one that is incredibly important, but man, we don't talk about it enough, and when we do, we talk about it the wrong way. So we're going to talk at the end of this about how to handle this emotion and what to do with it in kids. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 minutes. I'll give you a 2-minute warning as I always do, but you are free to go ahead and begin talking. I want to talk for just a second about anger, more so than I will with some other categories. I used to coach basketball, and when I coached basketball, something became really evident to me. When one of my athletes didn't know how to shoot free throws, I didn't run him for it. I didn't stick him on the gym floor and make him do push-ups for that. If a kid doesn't know how to shoot free throws, you teach a kid how to shoot free throws, right? When kids don't know how to manage anger, we punish it. We don't teach them how to manage their anger. We don't tell them what's okay to do when you're angry, what's not okay to do when you're angry. When I worked in Mesquite, the first question I asked parents when their kids would get in trouble for pulling stuff off of boards and for throwing things across the room, the first question I had for parents was, okay, when they're angry, what do you want them to do? What's an acceptable response to that anger? And most of the time, the answer I got was, not that. That's not an acceptable answer for kids. Kids need to be coached on how to manage anger, and here's why I'm saying that. In your marriage, you need to be coached on how to manage anger. There are certain things that I cannot do when I'm angry in the presence of my wife because for whatever reason, she kind of has her own triggers that she doesn't respond well to me doing certain things when I'm angry and vice versa. We know that because we talk about it. We actually have conversations about what's acceptable and what's unacceptable to do when we're angry. If you and your partner are not having those conversations, I encourage you to do so. And if you're only having those conversations when you're mad and yelling at each other, you're probably not as effective at it as you could be. Have a conversation with your spouse about what's okay when I'm angry, is it okay if we kind of walk away from each other, and if we do, how do we do that? If we don't coach each other in managing anger, we are walking into a hornet's nest when that emotion creeps in. And the same thing applies to our kids. If we're not teaching them how to manage their anger, we just punish it when it gets out of control, they are very confused. And they get in trouble a lot, and they don't know why until we explain it to them. We need to talk about why anger is not a bad emotion and how to manage it when it comes up. All right, I'm going to talk quickly about sadness for just a second. Before I do, take a look at your little quiz. I'm going to give you we're going to shorten this one a little bit. I want you to do the quiz, though, because there's something important we need to talk about. So get the quiz done. I'll give you about 60 seconds, and then we'll start talking. All right. As I have been telling you all night, each section has its own number. Sadness. If you scored a 5 or above, it indicates to me that you are probably not super comfortable with the experience of sadness. If you scored a 5 or above, it tells me that more than likely your family wasn't super open about it and maybe didn't help coach you through it. Now, here's why I say that. When I talk about sadness, I lose all the husbands. You know why? Because this is when I start sounding like a therapist. Now we get to talk about all the things that make you sad. Husbands, this is why we talk about it, because when your wife is sad, this is you. Wives, can you relate to that? For the record, you know where I found that? In my text messages. You know why I found it in my text messages? Because April was sad, and I had done what I normally do, and she sent this back, and she said, "Thanks for trying." It's okay. We don't know what to do with sadness. We have no idea what we're doing with sadness. Men, we handle sadness the way we handle a baby the first time we ever hold one. Like, it's delicate, and we don't want to break it, so we just kind of stand still and hope it doesn't see us. All right, listen, it is a problem for us to relate to our wives when it comes to sadness. And the reason for that is because I hate to tell you something. And I don't mean to bring the house down, but I need to tell you something. You're going to get sad from time to time. And men, I'm going to talk to you really directly. If you don't know what to do with that and you don't know how to process it, you know what happens? It festers for years. You don't feel like yourself. Your wife starts to notice that you've disconnected from her. She starts to notice that you don't do the things that you used to do for fun. You don't seem to enjoy the football games as much anymore. You don't seem to enjoy spending time with the kids as much anymore. And she doesn't really understand what's going on. And the reason that these things are happening is because you have something that triggered a turn into sadness, and you had no idea that that happened, and you didn't communicate it effectively, so it festered. Okay, that's why we're talking about sadness. So yes, I realize that this is super therapist-y, but I'm trying to give you more tools than the broom that reaches out to pat your wife on the head with it. Here's what I want you to do. We're going to shorten this conversation just a bit because the first question in this section is on the top of page 5. The first question actually kind of encapsulates the next two, so I only want you to focus on the first question. It is a super specific question. The question talks about between the ages of 12 and 17, something happened that made you feel bad or left out or sad. I am super curious as to how your parents responded to that. And the reason I'm curious as to how they responded to that is because that probably indicates to me how sadness was processed in your home. So here's what I want you to do. Answer that one question with your spouse, back and forth, and then if you get to number 3, get to number 3. But number 2, we're going to skip in the interest of time. I'm not going to give you as much time for this one, and I won't start the timer. I'm just going to be listening to me. Go ahead and start talking, and I'll tell you when we're moving on. Let me tell you what I'm listening for. When you ask that question, between the ages of 12 and 17, something happened to you that was embarrassing. How would your parents have handled it? If you heard things like, they would have talked to me, and they would have told me that they loved me, and they would have listened to me, and my mom would have sat there and cried with me, and she would have patted me on the back and then taken me out for pizza. You probably had a really strong emotion coaching family, a family that allowed you to feel what you were feeling and that coached you through that process, and that's really encouraging. If you heard things like, I would have been told to suck it up, buttercup, it's time to move on. If that's what you heard, you probably had a family that wasn't really highly emotion coaching. Which means when these things happen in your marriage and when they happen to your kids, you need to be very vigilant as to how you respond. Because that kind of dismissive emotion can be damaging to a child's development, and it can certainly be damaging to the intimacy in a marriage. So that conversation, if you feel like you need to continue that conversation, I want to encourage you to do so. While we've only got about 8 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have time to talk about the last one. Fear. I want you to start with the quiz as we've done. I'm going to give you the numbers and then we'll talk about fear. So it only take about 60 seconds. All right. If you have not tallied up your score yet, you're welcome to jot this number down, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to you. For fear, if you scored a 3 or above, that indicates to me that you are probably not all that comfortable with the experience of fear. You may have some difficulty in dealing with fear and anxiety. You also may struggle to experience other people's fears, and your reaction to that may be to just try to talk them out of it. Tell them all the reasons they shouldn't be afraid. So if that applies to you, great. If not, wonderful. I want to hear why. And by the way, it doesn't matter what you score on these quizzes. The conversation is important because if you scored in an area where you feel it's healthy, I want you to be able to talk to your partner about why. And if you score in a category or in an area that feels unhealthy, I want you to do the same. All right, take a look at number 1 specifically. I want to make sure you've answered number 1. I want to make sure you answer number 2. And number 3, we're going to talk about together here in a few minutes. So I'm going to give you, for those 2 questions, number 1 and number 2, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. So if you can have about 30 seconds for each person, and I will start the timer for this. I'm only going to give you 2 minutes to cover these two sections together, these two questions. So go ahead and begin, and I'll start the timer. The reason that I wanted to talk about fear tonight is because we don't talk about it nearly enough. And I want to make sure you understand what I mean when I say fear. I'm not talking about snakes and spiders, although it's valuable to have those conversations with your spouse. We don't talk about how to manage fear enough, and so as a result, we just avoid things that make us scared. I know that snakes and spiders can be a part of that, but let me tell you some things that you're afraid of, some things that I'm afraid of. Some things that everybody in this room is afraid of. Our kids' safety and our kids' well-being, our kids' health. This is why it's hard, by the way, it's why it's hard for moms to watch kids walk into kindergarten for the first time. It's why it's hard for moms to watch kids leave the house to do anything. It's not because they're overprotective dads. It's not because they're helicopter moms. It's because they're afraid. And if you don't recognize that as fear, you are in the risk of sounding really belittling in how you relate to them. Because they think to themselves, I'm just afraid that bad things are going to happen. And your response to that is, they'll be fine. Quit crying. They're just going to kindergarten, as Ryan said a week ago. Couple other things that we're afraid of. You're afraid of your own mortality. Oftentimes we're afraid of death, so we don't talk about it. So we leave our family members unprepared when we pass because we've never talked about it. We've never talked about what we want, what we need. How to handle aging parents. A lot of us are really afraid of how to manage our parents when they can no longer manage themselves. So we don't talk about it when we can, so when it happens, we're unprepared for it. What's going to happen to us when we're too old to take care of ourselves? That's a fear we all have. And as a result, we don't talk about it nearly enough. What's going to happen to our kids if something happens to us? We don't talk about it, so we're unprepared for it. We don't talk about it because we're afraid. What's going to happen if we don't have enough money? That is something that we're afraid of, so we don't talk about it. We're afraid that people are going to think our family is dysfunctional, or that we're poor, or that we're unhappy, or that we're all the negative things that we're afraid people are going to think we are. If we're not comfortable with fear, we're not going to discuss those things because they make us feel uncomfortable. I want you to be comfortable with the emotion of fear because I want you to be able to sit down with your spouse and talk about these things. Talk about what's going to happen when you need to take care of parents. Talk about what's going to happen when you need to be the one being taken care of. Talk about death. Talk about preparing for the rest of your life. Don't be afraid of it. You need to embrace it. And fear, if you're not on the same page about fear, you're going to have a hard time having those conversations. What's the point of all this? The point is, when it comes to nature versus nurture as a therapist, I tend to fall way more on nurture than I do on nature. That's not to say that nature is not a part of it, but nurture to me is way more important. In Mesquite, I worked for 5 years as a family support counselor. I did family therapy with over 200 kids' families a year in Mesquite for a 5-year period. That's a lot of kids. Not once did I ever meet a sociopathic kid. Now, I don't mean this as much of a shot as it's going to sound. When I met their parents, the kids made total sense. The kids' behavior made total sense when you meet the parents. All right, now I don't mean that to be a derogatory statement because I think the same thing is probably true of my kids. They make a lot of sense when you meet me, and just like yours make a lot of sense when they meet you. That's what I'm trying to indicate here. We exist in the context of the family in which we came from. Why are we talking about this tonight? Because if one of you is really strong and comfortable in an emotional area and the other one's not, guess what happens when you end up in conflict about that emotion? It looks like this. So you're super comfortable with sadness. Your husband's not. So then quickly into the conversation, by the way, you're not fighting. You're just dealing with emotion he's uncomfortable with. And pretty soon this happens. And he wonders, what is going on? You were sad and now I'm in trouble. What happened? I was just sitting here. A lot of husbands can relate to that. No, so here's the problem. The problem is he has to go and he'll tell his brother, or you'll be on the other end of that, and you'll go tell your sister, and now we got a whole big mess because we got one emotional wizard who's dealing with a whole bunch of people who aren't. I want to rid you of this type of conflict. We have a lot of conflict not over the fact that we don't get along or that we disagree, but over the fact that one of us is emotionally way more comfortable with something than another one is. All right, I realize I didn't give you enough time to go through every one of these questions. I also realize that there's a whole section on the back that I want you to take with you that's called Continuing the Conversation. And I know the bell rang, so let me say one quick thing about that question guide on the back. Those questions are unbelievably important to me. If you don't get to them this week, that's fine, but please do me a favor, get to them at some point. Some of them are very tough questions to answer. In what ways do you want to be like your mother and father, and in what ways do you not? That's a question I want you to talk about out loud. By the way, you know why we don't talk about that enough? We're afraid of the answer. We don't like the fear that comes with the idea that we may be similar to our parents. All right, tonight I realize it's been really emotional. The conversation's been about a lot of emotion. It hasn't been emotional, but it's been about emotion. Next week, we are going to take a bow on everything we've done up to this point, and we are going to take it and wrap it on a Christ-centered marriage. The goal next week is to talk about a Christ-centered marriage, how to do it, how to make it work, and how to make it last. And I'm going to use Jason a lot for that. I'm going to lean heavily on him. I apologize for keeping you a minute or two late. Let me close this out in prayer, and then we'll go. Father, I come to you now grateful for the people in this room, Lord. I praise you for giving them the inclination to want to better their marriage, and I pray that you'll give them the ability to do that. God, I pray that every time they walk in this door and every time they engage in these conversations, I pray that you'll allow them to say and to hear the things that you want them to say and to hear. And God, I pray that the end result of this is a room full of marriages that look more like the marriages that you designed them to be. God, I ask that you be with us as we go out the rest of the week. In Christ's name, amen. We got 2 weeks left. Try to be here. I think you're going to enjoy it. Have a good night.